Hello, everybody. Indeed, I work in the European Commission, which is, as you know, a supranational body based in Brussels. It's a space for cooperation between European countries, and I work in media program, which supports audiovisual sector in Europe. And I just want to give you a couple of information on what we are doing for audiovisual sector and especially for video games. And this presentation just give you a very quick overview of the program as such. It's a new program to support creative businesses in Europe. Then part of this program, which is called Media, where the specific support for video games is located. Then a bit more information about a specific program we are doing for development of video games, where you can actually get soft money from the program. Then a bit on the access to finance, and I will approach this from the debt financing point of view, because we are also working on so-called culture and creative sectors guarantee facility, which should make it easier to apply for bank loans for the companies from those sectors. And then finally a bit on the challenges we have with presenting video game sectors to member states and why we are having those challenges. So this is the program, Creative Europe. It's built on 4 big legs. One is support for cultural diversity in Europe. So we support, for instance, literary translation of books, cooperation of concert venues, and things like this. The second leg is media subprogram, which focuses on audiovisual sector, games included. And the main goal is to increase the circulation and production of audiovisual content in Europe. And then 2 other goals, much more smaller, are increasing the financial opportunities for the cultural and creative sectors. And finally, to support cooperation between the member states on those sectors by data collection, policy cooperation, etc., etc. So now on media, what we actually do, we invest parts of the budget. The budget for the whole program, 2014-2020, is in European terms quite limited. It's 1.4 billion euros. So annually, it's more or less 100 million, which is being implemented via the so-called calls for proposals, which are being published annually or biannually on the web pages of the executive agencies for education and culture. And if you want to apply for such a grant, you have to go to this web page. You have to fill in a form, and then your application is being assessed by independent experts. And if your proposal is good, you may get some soft money. And what we co-finance via different calls, we co-finance development work. The vast majority goes to films. So this should help to have European co-production finally. We co-finance TV programming and cooperation between televisions from different member states. And we also have a separate call for video games development. So this is part of the content. We also invest in skills by facilitating, by giving some money for trainings. And for the time being, a lot of this money goes just to cinema industry. As you know, they are very well structured. They are operating for over 100 years. They have a lot of schools, etc., etc. But there is an opportunity for video game sector as well to apply for this scheme and come up with a training scheme which could be useful for the companies from the sector. Finally, the second big leg is reaching to the audiences, because it's easy to produce content, especially now. It's much more difficult to reach out to the audiences. So we are financing so-called market access actions, and Thierry benefited from one of these actions. So this is to support business-to-business exchanges and for instance, help out to export the works, European works, to the external world. We are supporting distribution of European films. You probably may know European cinema networks. So this is to show non-national European films in other countries. And we support online distribution. And all this is also done in the frame of audience development and film literacy. So young people have a habit of consuming films and audiovisual works. So a bit more details on trainings. We have an annual budget for the whole EU of around between 7 and 8 million euros. This allows us to co-finance around 80 different training programs in the EU. So finally, this benefits over 1,500 professionals every year. And as you may see on the slide, there is a vast range of topics. I suppose a lot of them are quite relevant for your industry, especially such a dynamic industry with so quickly changing business models. With access to markets, we have annual budget of around 8 million euros. So this allows us to co-finance up to 60 different events where the industry could go and representatives could sell European works to the external world. And now a bit more about the specific call for the development of video games. This call is still open. This will close quite soon, actually, on the 3rd of March. But what we have in development is that, development also has, as I mentioned, different schemes. So we have the biggest slot for development of audiovisual production in sense of animation, creative documentary, or fiction. But I suppose there are some interlinks between video games production and development and this type of actions. We have a specific call for video games, 2.6 million. So you see it's much more smaller. But this is justified by the fact that this is a new support action of the EU. It has only started in 2014. So now we are actually having opened the third call only. We had support for video games before 2014, but this has been very strongly linked to audiovisual production. So we could support video games which are linked to cinema. Now this link is no longer there, but actually more and more video games are again basing story on the cinema. And the third element is the TV programming. We have more or less 12 million to produce European series. Now about the specific call for video games development. So this call is open to video game production companies only, not to publishing companies or distribution companies. They should be registered in an eligible country. It means that this is EU 28 plus some countries which signed a dedicated agreement with the European Union. The company should exist for at least 12 months. It should be a company with some track record, so it should produce and commercially distribute at least one game from 2013 up to the date of application. And the company should own the majority of rights related to the submitted project. The goal of this scheme is actually to help European companies to develop and keep the intellectual property in the EU. What we can support concept development or project development, leading to the playable prototype. This should be a narrative story, so the game should follow a kind of a logic, interesting story during the whole plot. The game should be intended for the commercial exploitation. As I said, the activities can only relate to the development, so no marketing costs, for instance, are allowed. This is actually for the development, so the production can only start 8 months after the date of submission of the project. And we list a number of types of projects which are not eligible for this type of support. Because actually the main goal of this instrument is to support content and creation of narration. Budget is 2.6 million. Minimum grant is 10,000 euros. Maximum grant is 150,000 euros. So for concept development, this can go up to 50,000 euros. For development of the prototype, up to 150,000. We can co-finance up to 50% of the eligible costs. As I mentioned, the deadline for application is very soon, on the 3rd of March. And all information, frequently asked questions, submission forms, etc., can be found on this web page. If you still have any doubts, there is an email address where you could probably address your concerns to the executive agency, and they will reply with pleasure too. Now I focus on the third element of my presentation, which is access to finance. You heard today a lot about venture capitals, about equity financing, which is very important for financing of cultural and creative sectors. Yet we are thinking and we are talking to the financial intermediaries, to banks mainly, and to the guarantee societies. But a lot of companies prefer to be financed via traditional bank loans. And actually, access to finance for the cultural and creative sectors is very difficult in Europe. This links to a number of factors which were confirmed with banks when we are talking to them. So you have always a prototype in this type of companies. Very often they don't have tangible assets in the company, they have only intangible assets in the company. And especially in Europe, for instance, taking a collateral on the intellectual property rights is very challenging. They have very specific cash flow schemes. Maybe it's less in video games production companies. But for instance, in cinema or music, they tend to they depend quite heavily on the subsidies, for instance, in cinema sector. So this makes, from the banking point of view, this makes sector quite tricky to invest. Consequently, firstly, banks, if they are giving a loan, they normally ask for a collateral which is external to the company. So for the private house, or for the private car as a collateral. And secondly, there are only few institutions in Europe, financial institutions, which are willing to work with cultural and creative sectors. And by cultural and creative sectors, I mean cinema, video games, music, museums, performing arts, visual arts. There's quite a number of those sectors, which, if you add them, they are quite a significant economic actor in Europe. They represent more or less 4% of the European GDP, which is a lot of billions of euros. And actually, to help the financial intermediaries to understand the sector and also extend their business opportunities, and to help the companies to have an access to a loan, the European Commission, together with the European Investment Fund, is creating a so-called Culture and Creative Sectors Guarantee Facility, which is a dedicated financial instrument for the sector. The rollout will be now, actually, in 2016. What it means, actually? It means that banks, via the European Investment Fund, will apply for a guarantee. The European Investment Fund will offer this guarantee to banks which are willing to create a dedicated loan product for the cultural and creative sectors. And one of the specificities of this product will be not only that the access to finance will be much more easier, because they will get a dedicated training on the specificities of the sectors, on how they perform, what are the main challenges, main market trends, etc., etc. But one of the things will be that the personal collateral, which is external to the company, cannot be really collateralized. So banks will not be able to ask for your private house or your private car to be part of this collateral in the exchange of the guarantee. So with public money, we are guaranteeing this type of financial operations. The budget of this fund starting 2016, and the fund will be open till 2020. As you know, European Union works on the 7 years long programs. It's 121 million, which should allow, with very conservative estimations, to generate over 600 million of loans for the sectors. So if you consider that this financial product is interesting for you, you probably should follow an Access to Finance web page. It's accesstofinance.eu, or the European Investment Fund web page. We estimate that the first loans will be given towards the end of 2016. Participation, who can request this loan? Only companies from the EU, EU28, and from Iceland and Norway. I just want to give you a bit more details about this additional element and this instrument, the so-called capacity building. This will be a specific training for banks to really understand. This will be normally what we planned. This will be a kind of an expert coming to risk department in banks. What we understood from talking to banks, risk departments are the most conservative when it comes to assessment of the loan applications of the companies from culture and creative sectors. And they will work together to understand what are the specificities of the sectors and what are also typical geographical specificities. With this, we think as in Europe, lending is very local, very national. There is no cross-border lending mainly. We think that with giving such a locally relevant expertise, the banks will be able to build portfolio. So in longer terms, they will know the risk profiles of the companies from those sectors. And finally, access to finance will be much more easier. Maybe on the access to finance for video games, I suppose a lot of companies are also using crowdfunding. This is not part of the Creative Europe program as such, but the European Commission now runs a dedicated study and an expert group on crowdfunding in Europe. And the goal of this study is to understand what are the practices of crowdfunding platforms in Europe, given the growing investment via the crowdfunding, what are the risks, and finally, how to make it easy for the crowdfunding platforms in Europe to cooperate together. Because there are a lot of elements linked to trust regulation, to the fees charged, which may either jeopardize the development of the sector in Europe or make it easier for the companies to collect funding through this instrument. And finally, when we are talking about video games industry in Europe, purely from the political level, it's quite challenging because we don't really have data on the economic performance, employment, and those type of information of the European video games companies. They are very difficult to chart via the traditional statistical methods. We have studies which are giving an overview at the global level. They are mainly focusing on the turnover of the sector, or they are very much like investment oriented. I think we need to chart this sector much more closer. I think this is quite important, not only to show to a number of decision makers in the member states that this sector has a certain size and what are the trends, but this also links, for instance, to education. This links to business cooperation, to training, support offered to the companies. And actually, given the lack of data, we read recently a study done by Nesta UK Innovation Agency, which was called Mapping of the UK Video Games Sector, which actually we think could help us to overcome these difficulties with mapping this sector. And actually, via Creative Europe program, we are also planning to launch a similar study at the European level to see who are the main actors, and we would like to cover the whole value chain of video games companies. So developers, publishers, other companies involved in the sectors, like tools developers or testers, etc. Finally, we would try to track where are they clustered, how many people they employ, what is their turnover. So at the end, we have a kind of a valid picture of the European video games market. And I think with such information, this will be much more easier for us to present this sector when we discuss with member states. Because as you know, the approach to the sector differs from one country to the other. And I think this is my last slide. I will finish with this. This is a feedback we got from one of the beneficiaries of the Creative Europe grant. And once more, if you have any questions on the grant schemes we run via the executive agency, then you can go to the executive agency webpage and you will have the full description. For the access to finance issues, in every member state there is so-called Creative Europe Media Desk, and he has the full overview of what is currently going on. And via the Creative Europe desks, we are also distributing a lot of information that could be useful for you. Thank you.
To fully understand, I was a little bit surprised how low the funding was for video games. And the problem is, if I was hearing you right, the lack of data for the European Union to map out the industry, is that the reason why? I'm just trying to understand the last comments that I heard that the lack of data, the lack of knowledge of the industry of video games inside Europe is so low in the EU, that this is one of the main reasons why the funding is not bigger. Is that correct? Because if you look at Scandinavia, I mean, Europe is probably the most profitable mobile continent in the world. Sweden and Finland are responsible for the top 3 grossing games in history. Mm-hmm. Just wondering, is this really the fact that there's a lack of data in EU?
I think lack of data is one of the problems when you look at the coordination of support programs in the member states. And I think this depends very much on, if you want, a philosophy of the state. So you know, Sweden and Finland are very much like innovation oriented. And when they think that, you know, support for video games, you know, it's...
Maybe I should clarify. I mean, Europe is really video game oriented, not just the Nordic countries. I'm just surprised that they haven't submitted the data and somebody has to kick somebody to send you the data. If that's the reason why, I mean...
So maybe I was not clear enough. We have bits and pieces of data. So we have, you know, data for the UK. We have, for instance, data for Scandinavia, but we don't have EU 28 wide data. And I think this is, from the purely coordination point of view, from my work, this is quite important, you know, because why, for instance, development of video game scheme, it's only around 3 million euros annually. This is historically based.
Just to give you a comparison, you said 3 million.
Yeah.
That's about the revenue of Candy Crush in one day, if you know that game.
Yes, but what we are doing, I think it's also quite, you don't have a lot of this type of support programs in Europe. We are supporting development of the concept, of the narrative game. So, we have very limited budget, as I mentioned, and the program traditionally was only for the cinema. And I think this is a right development, you know, that we extending the scope now. So this is just the first step.
No, don't get me wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
You should then get help, and the data. I mean, that means somebody has to basically send the data. So that could be because it's a good program.
Yeah.
But that's my point. It's not your fault. Somebody has to give you the data, right? So, thank you.
Is it the fact that only EU states are eligible to apply for the program? Because I come from Serbia and there's a great market potential to be exploited there, and I was thinking whether the program is eligible for countries that are in Western, like Balkans and stuff.
There are different levels of participation because it's the United European Union program, but associated countries, and Serbia is one of them, can participate. This is just a subject of the signature of the agreement. And I suppose, I'm not sure, but I suppose Serbia has signed this agreement with the EU. So this can be also checked on the webpage. So you have the list of countries which could participate.
Okay. So as I understood, you also fund like industry development and educational programs?
We could, indeed, not via the Creative Europe program, but we have other programs for education, for instance, Erasmus+, you may know. Yeah. So this helps students to go abroad and study, but this also helps, for instance, higher education establishment to cooperate together and create common curricula. And I think, I'm not sure in video game development or designing there is any cooperation, but there is for sure cooperation of film schools in Europe, which is funded via the
I was thinking more in terms, because in Serbia universities are still not, they don't have gaming directions, right? Mm-hmm. So people are mostly self-taught. So it would be good to think in the direction that investing in training in this market where wages are low, where people can dish out good quality content, which can be narrative based or it can be inputted with cultural heritage. I'm guessing that's the focus of the competition.
So actually, you know, this is our ambition with this study. For instance, if you look at this Nesta study on mapping of video games industry, you will see that video games companies are very often clustered around universities or schools. And I think this is an excellent example for the Ministry of Education in a given country, for instance, to see that there is a clear link between the education and job creations. But for this, you have to have data. And at the European level, we don't have this data. So.
Just to say, on the European basis, on Erasmus, there is a program called Game Jam Today, which is between different schools and different clusters. I think the Dutch Game Garden is part of it as well, and where they do so game jam between schools as well.
I'm curious. We all want to have innovation in video games, and narrative has been picked as the particular area where you want innovation to happen. But do you see the program widening in the future to mechanical innovation or aesthetic innovation or emotional expression innovation within the games beyond that slightly kind of small, like more focused area of just narrative?
Yes, I hope this will grow, you know. What I presented today was just Creative Europe program, which is, you know, so the main focus is the competitiveness of culture and creative sectors and cultural diversity in Europe. But at the EU level, there are other programs, like Research and Development Program, Horizon 2020. And under this program, this type of research could be financed. So, you know, it just takes a little bit to check for different elements. So, yes, this type of activities already can be financed, even though they are not, you know, like sector specific. Yes, this one is sector specific, and Horizon 2020 you have to compete with other innovations.
So Horizon 2020 focuses on R&D, and have there been games awarded under that so far, or is that?
Not games, but they finance like game engines, for instance, and this
Thank
type of hardware. If you want.
Mhm.
And yeah, in H2020 there is also a gamification and game call in April as well. So they're a bit on game as well. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks.